Well, hello everyone. Today we're joined by Michael Barron, known to some as Maury Michael Barron. He is an independent scholar turned graduate student whose groundbreaking discoveries now continue within the Department of Archaeology at Yale University. As an epigraphist, he interprets ancient Semitic texts, especially Proto-Semitic, an early stage of Hebrew. Michael has most recently authored a proto-thesis, a pioneering study of Proto-Semitic inscriptions found in the Sinai Desert and Egypt. This work has sparked international attention by proposing that these early alphabetic texts may contain some of the oldest extra-biblical references to Moses. He suggests these inscriptions could provide historical context for biblical traditions in Genesis and Exodus, traditions which in turn help explain what is seen in the inscriptions. Michael brings a unique perspective. He holds a degree in anthropology from UC San Diego and studied archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem on Mount Scopus, continuing now at Ariel University. At the same time, he is traditionally trained Torah scholar and retired Orthodox rabbi. This combination opens bold new discussions at the crossroads of archaeology, language, and biblical tradition. We're honored to have him with us today. So, Michael, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm honored to be here with you.
Again, thank you for joining me. And for my first question, how many inscriptions are there that you've found or translated that are connected to the historical Moses, and when do they date?
Sure. So within a much larger clade, basically all the wordy inscriptions, in this, Proto-Sinaitic, which basically is like a very early Hebrew. It's a proto-alphabetic script found in the Sinai Desert and in Egypt. So I studied about 23 to even 24 of those. I basically have studied the whole gamut of these, about 7 or 8, and it can be 7 or 8, seem to be from a common author. And within that group, there are 2 who actually seem to have attributions to this Moses. And according to their themes, and there's just so much that binds them together, it really begs the question, could this be the historical person behind the biblical traditions of Moses?
So when do those inscriptions date? When were they created?
So that's a very big question, area of contention. There are several of them that, with very little doubt, almost everyone in the field understands them to date to the time of a very important pharaoh for this period. That is Pharaoh Amenemhat III. So Pharaoh Amenemhat III is understood to have ruled about 3,800 years ago. Now, there are several very important scholars in this field who are chronologists. I have a decent familiarity with the subject of chronology, which, by the way, has been called the backbone of history. In other words, if you can understand chronology properly, by understanding, in this case, biblical chronology and, correct, proper chronology of ancient Egypt, okay, that is really the foundation for being able to say anything. But essentially, this time where we see this influx of Semites, of Hebrews, coming into Egypt, what is often called the early Hyksos period, or for those, like myself, who understand this to be, the what is behind the traditions of Genesis, the sojourn of Israel in Egypt. So, some people call it the Proto-Israelite period. But essentially, there is a tremendous amount of compelling evidence that this is the time that, that those earlier inscriptions, that they date to the time of the early sojourn of the Israelites. That basically, and now on the other hand, these inscriptions are very difficult to date, and that is the truth. The ones that are not clearly associated with the time of Amenemhat III, some may understand these to be of the same age, 3,800 years old. I, however, understand that these inscriptions were written over a period of time. And there is very good room to speculate that these inscriptions, that I would ascribe perhaps to a Moses, then I actually see those elements, those attributions, perhaps even signatures on two of these inscriptions. I think that it's very likely they go back to 3,500 years ago. That's a little bit complicated because, there are different models of chronology when it comes to ancient Egypt. But according to the one that I privately subscribe to, and this is not, in the thesis per se, because I'm trying, to separate a bit, these findings from needing to be married per se to one particular theory of chronology. But I understand that the 13th dynasty, which is where all of this evidence that we would point to and say, this sounds a lot like what we read about in the book of Exodus. Semitic slaves with actual names that appear in the book of Exodus and Genesis. So there's clearly, Hebrew Semitic slavery going on. The Ipuwer papyrus and the slave pits at Avaris, the plague pits at Avaris, where we see a lot of people who have died by plague, and even evidence of a massive, massive earthquake that basically caused that area, which is biblical Goshen, actually, because that area of the Nile Delta, right, it is actually biblical Goshen. It seems that, so you're right at the end of that period, that whole area needs to be rebuilt. So when what we call as the later Hyksos, when that Semitic group comes in, they need to rebuild that whole area. So that sounds a lot like the oldest traditions about the 10th plague, which is, we're talking Apartanus, who is, in other words, we have just several generations. We see Josephus mentioning this as well. We have it in Samaritan tradition as well, that 10th plague was a massive earthquake. So in short, in a nutshell, what I'm describing for you is that we have so much within the 13th dynasty in particular that really suggests the time of the sojourn of Israel. And so there's definitely healthy room to postulate, to propose that these inscriptions that really seem to bring the revolution of Moses to life, that they date to 3,500 years ago, not 3,800 years ago, but 3,500 years ago. And if I could just add to that, this is a mistake that a lot of people make, from the outside world, particularly concerning my background when I was in the rabbinical circle. Interestingly enough, that stint of my life was very much in the middle. I've now returned to my academic roots, but this is not for the sake of proving the Bible. In other words, the paper itself is totally focused, all 214 pages of my proto-thesis that you mentioned, it is actually focused on what do these inscriptions say. So on one hand, there are colleagues of mine in the field who happen to be evangelical Christians, and it's very, it's just, I had always separated myself from them because they were just seeing Moses like jumping off of every page, off of every inscription, and it just seemed almost like they were spinning things to prove the Bible. And I've always been so loath to do that because, like, who are you fooling? I mean, don't these inscriptions deserve to be understood in their own light? However, it is no less, not academic and just not a tenable, perspective to come from that. It is never Moses because there couldn't be Moses. In other words, it's never the genesis of Hebrew culture, and an actual historical context for biblical traditions, because that stuff is never true. That is not a tenable position either. So literally, for the purpose of understanding these inscriptions, I'm just simply bold enough, I don't know why that needs to be considered bold, to actually show, how these really provide, I would say, almost mutual support for one another. Points within the core narrative of the Pentateuch and these inscriptions. And and I don't think that these things this is not a religious discussion per se. Again, in order to poke at it, in order to neutralize it, some people are really trying to make this look like a religious discussion. This is a historical matter. Let's say, for example, that there are ancient Chinese legends, let's say, about a mythical or legendary ancient Chinese king who, let's say, was the founder of a dynasty, let's say, for many thousands of years ago. And of course, as scholars understand, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And, we're not going to go look at that myth necessarily, or that legend, as perfect historical truth that has to be true per se. Okay. But if someone were to find really compelling, a broad set of extraordinary evidence that suggests the actual existence of this person, I don't think the world would consider that controversial. But always, because of that incessant and very, sad political friction between religious and secular, people have become so tribal. And just as a going out point, they will just simply stick to their guns. Either, everything has to be within this narrow understanding of how they read the Bible, vis-a-vis those people who those traditions could never have a genuine historical context.
So what do these inscriptions say? And can you show us what they say specifically?
Sure, most definitely. What I'll do is I'll share my screen. Okay, so first of all, what I'd like to just to maybe begin with, obviously we can't get into many of these, is something, for example, that is completely not religious in nature. Okay, in other words, these are not all about cult. They're not all about, Baalat, which seems to be the figure behind the cult of the golden calf, those traditions in the biblical narrative, but just about life, of Semitic slaves. So this, for example, I just happened to land on this. We have Sinai 345, which is the very famous Serabit Sphinx. Okay, and basically, you have to, and this is so important, relate to the important opinions of your colleagues and those who preceded me in this work. And what this basically says here is something very common for these types of inscriptions. They are accompanied sacrifices, offerings, okay, to basically the golden heifer, the golden cow goddess, which basically became understood in the Torah as the golden calf deity. And this says simply, beloved for us is this, and this is for Baalat, or like in Hebrew of our time, me'uhab alenu da wada lebaalat. And what's awesome about this is how we see that this was a dialect of Hebrew that clearly goes back to a time when Aramaic and Hebrew were much closer. So, for example, a yeshiva student of today, of modern, of Orthodox Judaism today, will be able to read this very clearly because he knows, both Hebrew and Aramaic. But here we see, that this is a dialect, of what we would call a Proto-Semitic, where you have these Aramaisms. So it's really cool. So this would be considered an early time, an early inscription, probably going back to the time of Pharaoh Amenemhat III. In fact, for sure, because it literally has a symbol, a cartouche of Pharaoh Amenemhat III on its chest. So then we have, and this is just, this is another beautiful example. We're on a cliff face, very close to Sarabit el-Khadim, where these Hebrew miners were working, these Hebrew slaves. And in fact, that is what Sarabit el-Khadim means. It means in Arabic, the cave of the slaves. So this is a very ancient Bedouin tradition, which is even preserved in the language. So as you see here, this is an image from my mentor, Dr. Ludwig Morenz, from his very important textbook. So here we have the inscription, okay? And, he's just, highlighting it in white, okay? And other inscriptions, which are clearly in this ancient Semitic script where they took hieroglyphs and turned it into the world's first phonetic alphabet. And when you read it, it reads as a Proto-Hebrew. And you see that they seem to be associated with, okay, just check out these, proto-alphabetic, proto-Sinaitic letters with a stele, okay, a proud royal inscription of Pharaoh Amenemhat III. Okay, and what does it say? To my reading, and this, I can't tell you how many times I redid my thinking on this. This is because you have to be so careful. Just a single element of one glyph can change everything. And in here, I again, relate to other opinions, and so people can really, so scholars in the field can really understand what I'm seeing here. And it says something really profound. It says, to my reading, Ula'ad hu haver ada rach rav. And again, that's probably not the way that would have sounded in the Hebrew of those times, but and forever he is a friend, Ada, a gentle master. And what this is, to my understanding, is it's giving honor to a taskmaster who is gentle with the slaves. They weren't just, evil taskmasters beating their slaves to death. This seems to hark back to a time when, this servitude of the Semite population was more gentle. And putting it next to the stele of Pharaoh Amenemhat III is kind of like honoring the king. It's like, hey, thank you for, giving us such a good taskmaster. It seems to be in memoriam. That's how I would interpret it. And you have other inscriptions that talk about the travail and how they're suffering. And would it be appropriate for me to mention my master course?
Sure.
Okay, great. So first of all, I'm inviting the wide public, the wide respectful public of different backgrounds to come to my master course to actually unlock this proto-thesis, this work of almost a decade, so that you can actually understand my methodology and understand how we can understand these inscriptions and why we understand them to mean what they mean, elements that seem more speculative, elements that we're more confident in, and just how the elements that we're more confident in really carry the message and the interpretations. So it's beginning the 14th. That's a little over a week. It's 9 days from now. Maybe by the time this video gets out, it'll be just a week. But we're going to have a link in the description below, and we would love to have any of you. And this is for the lay person. So that's what's unique about this. If you're someone that says, you know what, it sounds really interesting, but it's just so beyond me, this is geared towards the lay person. So it's going to be 3 Sundays. It's a mini course, a master course, 3 Sundays in a row, 14th of September, the 21st of September, and the 28th. And we're going to get into everything that it would be, I don't even feel comfortable publishing at this. We're going to go really deep, and we're going to have a lot of Q&A, so you can actually really participate. So we'll have that in the, or Jacob will provide that in the description below. So yeah, so those are 2, and I started with those really, so that people really understand that this is not about proving the Bible per se. That's not what this is about. But it just happens to be that, if we're not going to be totally biased and come in, with a never Moses, never Israelites, because it has to be a myth, right? It happens to be that there are those that really suggest, that elements of the biblical narrative of what's happening with the Hebrews, with the early Israelites in Egypt, in particular, this revolt of those following El being the God of the Hebrews, right? And their revolt to purge from their midst what was basically a sex cult, basically a prostitution sex cult to keep the minors happy. This is something that is not uncommon, in mining camps until even, recent history. You'll always see, mining camps, being associated with prostitutes, prostitution being brought in. And what you see in some of these inscriptions is something that no one really noticed before I began my work, and that we have inscriptions here that do not praise Baala, that golden cow-eared goddess of, the golden calf cult. And it's very clear, by the way, that it is that cult. And for example, when Moses comes down from the mountain in the Bible, we see that he sees the people involved in orgies, essentially. And they are they're worshiping this golden cultic idol that Aaron created. And all of that is just so much Sarah Beit Chalim. It has what we see here at Sarah Beit Chalim just written all over it. It just happens to be that the way that Hathor, which was essentially the Egyptian name for Baalat, that was the Egyptian name for this cow goddess. This is the way that her cult is described in the ancient Egyptian texts. These orgies, because essentially this was, their sex cult, definitely related to the cult of Ishtar in the East, and what would later become, the cult of Aphrodite among the, among the, yeah. So, so what we have is this are these inscriptions that don't praise her, that are not offering offerings to her. There are inscriptions that are offerings to El, to God, and cursing out the golden calf deity. And by the way, you see me switching between golden calf and golden heifer. I'm just using golden calf so that people are on, can follow. But it's very clear from very early translations, very ancient translations of the Pentateuch, that rather than Egel Zahav, it was probably Eglah, or it seems to have been female. And we have other evidence as well. And that would be, by the way, a very, very easy slit to make, because you wouldn't even have different letters per se. Just in terms of the way that early Hebrew was written without vowels. So I'll show you one of those, because I can't steal too much fire, from the, from the course itself. So this is the most well-known. It's got the most press. So here you have a really profound one of this I would call Moses clade, okay, mosaic type, or reminiscent of with a mosaic message here. This inscription is called Sinai 349. And what you have here is right to left writing, just as we do actually in the in Hebrew. And by the way, in those days you could write Proto-Sinaitic right to left. You could write it left to right. It could be boustrophodon, meaning as the ox plows in this kind of zigzag, or in a circle. But here we see the beginning of right to left, which is the way that biblical Hebrew is written. And what does it say to my reading? So first of all, you're going to notice different colors. You're going to notice white. You're going to notice a light green. Again, according to the background, just to be able to see more clearly, I'll shift a bit. But you have this kind of an interim green or beige, and you have gray. Gray are things that I admit are speculative. Yes, indeed. I understand that this is what's probably written, but it's not clear. Elements that you could see very clearly if you have a very high-res image. That is this interim color that here is light green. And those that any eye can see, or is in white. Now, with that in mind, notice how the letters, and again, I'm sorry, your non-Hebrew reading or non-scholarly audience is not going to get this. For that, I'm inviting everyone to the master course. But you'll see that the message is carried by the glyphs that are clear. And what it seemed to say is, Entaz sha'ar ben qab nimosh erech milbala anu le'achinu bosh boshet asu nevala asu avon, which basically seems to that would mean in Hebrew. I just love to say it in the Hebrew, even though I know that 99% of your people don't want to hear it, because it's so beautiful to hear it. Lo, I cut down the gate of the accursed one. That's Sha'ar ben Qab, male. Gone. Okay. It is the value. Okay. Nimosh. Okay. Nimash erech milabala. Gone is the value of those following Bala, belonging to Bala. They have no value anymore. So this may suggest, perhaps, if we might speculate a little further, maybe this is a time when somehow there was a disturbance in the slavery period. And maybe they were not exactly slaves at this point. It says here, Anu le'achinu, give answer to our brothers, and tell them, respond to them. Okay, and this is something that we see in inscription after inscription after inscription. Boshet, which means for shame. Be ashamed of yourselves, or be ashamed. They have committed sin, okay? We have committed sin, they've committed sin. And again, obviously, if you're gonna have somebody like me coming and saying, oh, look at this message that I was able to understand from here, you would be completely it would be completely appropriate for you to go, biased much. But when you do this rigorously and critically, and you find the same word patterns in inscription after inscription after inscription, you can't deny it. And when, these inscriptions of this type were cursing out Bala, when they actually have this element of that, Moses attribution / signature, it actually it begs the question even further. And by the way, those are very not necessary. Those elements, okay, of those signatures were only found last minute. Actually, after this was already due. But just check out some of these others, like we have here Sinai 351, which I would also put in this clade. Also, Dr. Ludwig Morenz understands that there is El here. He understands that Lamed actually was probably in a broken off chip. But that is not controversial to understand that some of these inscriptions are votive. They're worshiping El, not Ba'alat. And so what do we see here? We also have this word hub, okay, hub, curse. And we also have nimosh, which here I understand seems to mean let us leave. And we have several of these, like maybe 4 of these inscriptions that in that same sense and that same wording have bosh nimosh. Bosh nimosh. In one after another. Be ashamed. Let us leave. Let us depart from here. And And I don't know how it is that in all of the people who have related supposedly to my work, and I say that supposedly because it's been more of a caricature of, thereof, um, people are completely ignoring one of the major elephants in the room, and that is um, Mount, what is basically probably the oldest tradition of Mount Sinai and Horeb that there are. So, sorry, I'm doing that to your eyes. If you go, for example, to Appendix 2, you have a whole section on these mountains that loom in the distance from Sarabit el Khadim. And they are literally called, until this day, Jebel Sania and Jebel Horiba. And even if you don't know anything about Hebrew, you know that Sania sounds like Sinai and Horiba sounds like Horeb. Now, what's very powerful is that there is no cult that we know of, no religious group within the last 2,000 years, which seems, to have any sort of connection with this place. When we have, the Jebel Musa, Jebel Safsafa, which, the Catholic Church came to hallow. And clearly, when you're going to have monks that are going to be there around Mount St. Catherine for centuries, I mean, it's very hard for the modern mind to just grasp how old that cult is, that religious group, the monks there. And yet, when it comes to biblical times, 2,000 years ago is really late. And so when you're going to have monks that are there, they're going to be looking back on their terrain because that's their world. And they're going to understand, for example, the path of the Exodus accordingly. But this is something whose names remain, but the people who gave them that names, the cult, the people of that tradition are gone from there. We have so that makes this very profound. Jebel Sania and Jebel Horabi, or Jebel Horiba, are definitely somebody's Mount Sinai and Horeb. And this mining camp of Sarabit el Khadim is literally, it definitely can be said, at the foot, so to speak, or before Mount Sinai. And so this, goes into all the questions that I'm sure, people are having. Wait a minute, those are two mounts. I thought that they were one. What about water? It was, a desert. How could you have thousands of people subsisting? There are no graves. What are you going to do about, So all of these issues are important questions, which are related to. So when you dare to actually open your mind without any obliging yourself to agree, but you actually take in this picture of 8 solid years of work. It's actually been 9, but 8 in solid work. To deny that this picture is not, quite a compelling one, and definitely part of the serious conversation, does not seem intellectually honest.
And what about the inscription that says this is from Moses? Can you
Oh,
notice
okay.
that one?
Sure, definitely. So you have 2 of them, by the way, but I'll go to the famous one. That is Sinai 357. And we're almost there. Here. Okay, so it's very interesting about this inscription is that this was the very first inscription that I ever interpreted when I was really a newbie and I really just had so much less knowledge and experience than I do now. And as much as I have changed my mind and redone so many of these inscriptions, and not for lack of trying, but my original interpretation of this, I still stand by it. So what we had until now, and what the whole world is aware of, I mean, the world of scholarship, are two lines here. A vertical line, okay, sort of a heap, okay, of characters, and then a horizontal one. And I've always understood this to mean, and again, not for lack of trying, and by the way, not for lack of being bothered by the biblical theme, but I can find no better interpretation than "En toshgandach mila av bemanach." Lo, I root out an oppressed garden. Okay, this is something that's poetic, and by the way, it clades together with others that are more prayerful, um, that are more how can you say of that higher more of a cultic perspective, right? Who is for the Father? Mi le'av be'manach. Who is for the Father in regards to your man? This is very important also for Egyptian religion, because if we look for the parallel deities, to El and Yah, you have Ptah, who is the father of the gods, the father of the other powers of the universe. So, and it's very clear. We even have this in ancient Jewish and ancient, in biblical tradition. You see that Patach, that name Patach, which literally means the opener of creation, right? In Hebrew, Poteach, is a name of God. Just people don't notice this in the Bible itself, and it happens to be a deity that was worshipped in Egypt. There were those who were completely devoted to him. For example, in Memphis, not Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis, ancient Egypt, which happens to be where we understand that Moses would have been raised. In other words, when you do the chronology and you get it right, according to my mentors, you will come to the late 13th dynasty, where the capital, okay, was Memphis. Guess who the patron deity of Memphis was? Ptah, literally the creator. And the connections, between, the faith of El, of God, and the cult of Ptah, it is incredible. There is a long list of just uncanny bridges between the two. It is impossible that they are not two versions of the same thing. So what's very powerful is that Ptah was stoic. In other words, when you read his text and his cult, they're against promiscuity, debauchery. There's in the writings, of that cult of Ptah that go back to even Old Kingdom times. You'll see the importance of loyalty to one's wife, like we find in Mishlei and Proverbs. So the idea, the father, this is not only very biblical. We see this in so many biblical names, right? But we also see it in the very parallel to El among the Egyptian pantheon. So what we have here seems to be, okay, something that what God does or what God does, and you have a challenge to the people of faith, of perhaps about faithlessness in regards to the man or responsibility. And what is manna? Manna is not like something supernatural or hocus pocus. This is something that is known as mon until this day among the Bedouin Arabs of the area, and it is derived from from the environment. There's a couple of different opinions as to what mon actually was. I think it may well have been more than one thing, but it is indeed, it would have been part of the sustenance of slaves escaping from Egypt, sojourning in the desert. So then you have, in a smaller inscription, going another direction, as if it's someone who doesn't want his words to be confused with this larger one. It's almost like showing deference. This says in plain Hebrew, Shema Amar Arba, which means hearken, says Arba. Here we have some strengthening by someone who probably was a chieftain, a person who was a someone in this community, who is trying to get people to hearken to this. It's very simple Hebrew, and not just, and this is, Semitic in general is not complicated. All these early Semitic dialects were very interrelated. Then, my really good friends from Patterns of Evidence sent me, per my request, but very kindly, the best images of this inscription. They actually went to Mine El. They actually went to Surah Beit al-Khadim, and they sent me the highest res images on the planet on this. And I know because I've been searching for them high and low. And I noticed 4 letters descending a little bit away into the right, a little bit lower down, and they just read very plainly, Zot Mi Moshe. This is exactly how you would write that in this very early script. This is from Moses. So first thing I did, of course, was run this by my academic supervisor. He saw it right away. And then he publicly, put out as a comment on my, my Facebook post. I was very excited about it. And he said, this is clearly seen. This is not imagination. It's truly well detected. It's one of the great moments in my career so far. Just one of the most vindicating moments. But what's very important is something that I really want to impress is that, again, one inscription was something that looks like this is from Moses. I mean, if you are a critical thinker, you will almost not allow yourself to believe such a thing. And it's very important to be critical like that, because, who are you fooling? And people who take religion seriously also need to be very, careful with such thinking. But what I want anybody who looks at my proto-thesis, and I hope that you'll put the link down in the description below to that as well. If you just want an overview of the argument altogether, relating to all of the inscriptions that are described then in great detail, just go to section 2. Here you have an overview, and actually, everything is explained in short. And we get to 4 inscriptions here that I just put side by side. And again, this is so not even necessary for the argument that these seem to have what to do with the traditions behind Exodus. I mean, the inscriptions really seem to speak for themselves. But this was all found very much at the 12th hour, not even the 11th hour. We have Zotmi Moshe. We have in Sinai 361 what we understand to read Neum Moshe, which is so powerful. We actually find this, among the prophets, in the Bible. Neum Hashem, says God. And we actually have here a Baalat inscription. It's so classic. This literally just says in the simplest Hebrew, Titen Zot Mezuha Baalat Pat. Give this golden Baalat bread, a bread offering. Anyone who knows Hebrew, if I would just say that, they would be like, why? They would totally get it. And we see here this element of what looks like a signature coming down at an angle a little bit lower down to the right. And it seems to say Ada. You remember that name from what we spoke about, the Wadi al-Nasib inscription that gave honor apparently to this kind, gentle taskmaster, Ada. Well, guess what? Ada, as a representative of the crown, there to oversee the slaves, what would he be doing at Sarabith al-Khadim? At some point, he's probably going to offer at the Baalat temple. Could this be the same person? Or it could be another Ada. We don't know. But we do is that I understand that there is the signature of an Ada here. And so, and then we have this one, which we looked at before, 351, and it seems to, it is speaking of this prophetic voice, apparently, that several of these seem to speak in, where it's, El speaking, so to speak. And you have here, as in like the one that it is attributed to, El. Who speaks for El in the traditions I've been speaking of? Moses. Several of these. Again, I can't give you more because it's going to steal fire from the master course. And by the way, there's so much more to share with you guys. But there are literally prayers, to El. And we see the work of a priest to El. So again, it's a lot to take in. It's obviously something that takes a lot of study and a lot of contemplation, and that's what this master course will be about. So, so we have these elements of attributions just in this way, and if we see Moses, and you wouldn't even need that if you actually read what these inscriptions seem to say. So, whereas we need to be critical, and I really try to be humble and not fall in love with my own theory, which is a little bit difficult at this point, as it is for any scholar, but there is room here to be, cautiously very excited. And it's important also to note it that this is a proto-thesis. This is not the thesis. But this is the accepted base of my master's and PhD theses, which are literally in the works. So something like 90% of the work is done, but there will be improvements. And I'll definitely be relating to constructive criticism of peers. Anything else, my friend?
Could you show us the other inscription referencing Moses?
Yeah, so that would be this, and I don't want to, tell too much about it. I
Sure.
actually mentioned it, Neum Moshe. Thus says Moses, a statement of Moses. And again, what this says is or seems to say, is absolutely incredible. And there is no inscription that I worked harder on than Sinai 361. But it's the labor of love.
And what about the mention of Joseph or a character that's a historical
Okay,
figure that's very similar
sure,
to
sure, sure.
Joseph? Can you tell us a
So,
little bit about him?
sorry, can you repeat the question because I spoke over you?
Yeah, I'm asking about Joseph. Is there a historical figure that you reference in the Proto-Thesis that's similar to Joseph?
Yeah, thank you for asking, because with all this talk about Moses, there's almost as much material, um, on, sort of suggesting the influence of a Joseph-like high Semitic official. And so we're not going to, we don't actually have a mention of a Joseph per se, but there are elephants in the room, just these not talked about points, in the work of, several of my very esteemed colleagues that just seem to not relate to, the clear influence of Semitic elites, Hebrew elites, and probably a seminal, a very important, very authoritative Egyptian Hebrew within the court of the king, of the Pharaoh. And and now it's very important. Again, I do not want to be, cast as someone who's trying to prove the Bible. That all becomes very important when trying to understand one of the most important inscription of them all, Sinai 350. So in Sinai 350, we have this inscription that in the name of El, that seems to be poking this one gently at the prostitute cult of Baala, and actually saying that El draws close to him prostitutes, daughters who have offered love. And it's clear. And by the way, this is one of the clearest of the inscriptions. My letter IDs agree perfectly with those of Dr. Ludwig Morenz, and they're quite clear. But what's so fascinating about 350 is what we see in the upper right-hand corner. We see what looks like a blended in, a kind of a unification of two names of the Pharaoh, okay? Of the Pharaoh, Amenemhat III. So so there are some who will say, and this is an important opinion out there, that see things like this suggest that these were illiterate Semites, illiterate miners, who are basically taking hieroglyphs and just making it their own. And there does seem to be something of that. There does definitely see this. In other words, when Proto-Sinaitic, this foundation of all the phonetic alphabets, when it comes out, it's very clear what these Semites are doing. They're like, we have, for example, a mem, ma, okay, in our language that we speak, okay? And it happens to be that our word for water is mayim, or mem, okay? And this, I'm intentionally saying it in some kind of an Israeli accent here, just for fun. You see this wave, this wave in this Egyptian letter. It looks like waves, it looks like water. So we're going to call this mem, ma. And this will stand for the sound ma, basically ignoring that this is na. This is actually n, or just, ignoring what this is actually in Egyptian. So that, there is this understanding that it kind of looks like they were just creating an alphabet from the hieroglyphs by people who themselves did not know hieroglyphs. I challenge that. I think that there definitely is that spirit of we're going to make this our own. But inscriptions such as Sinai 350 and others, they evince a hand that is so refined to write, to inscribe on this stone is not an easy thing to do. And you don't even see in some of these any evidence of rewriting or scratching or fixings. Some of them you do in other places, but what you have, now look at this, how fine the hand of this cartouche is. I am not guesstimating these lines. They are that straight. Okay, so this element, okay, of the sun, their sun deity, it really is that round. This does not look like the work of some illiterate Semite who's having fun with hieroglyphs. And also, in an inscription dedicated to El, or speaking about how the love of El, of that deity of God. Why, like as we would say in Hebrew, Mahakesher, what's even the connection of putting the name of the pharaoh in the upper right-hand corner? It's almost as if this is somebody who is associated with the court. It seems pretty clear that this is meant to give some serious respect to the message, and could even convey that this is a person who has speaks for the pharaoh or is a representative of him. Now, clearly, there are other possibilities, but again, now in the proto-thesis, if you go to section 4, it's a whole section. It's very important, because if we are speaking about a Moses-like character, then there should clearly be before then something like a time of the sojourn. There should be a time when there were Hebrews, there were Semites, okay, in Egypt, who were not enslaved, but in fact were very powerful. And because that is the story. And that is indeed, story or not, what is suggested by a good deal of evidence, particularly around this figure, Anhu. Anhu. Now, why is Anhu important? First of all, he lives at that time that would be very appropriate for Joseph. And that name, it basically would have meant in ancient Egyptian, the living one, like Ankh, life. Why is that so profound? Because that works with what Joseph is his Egyptian name in the Genesis tradition. He's called Safanat Pa'aneach. Safanat Pa'aneach. And that seems pretty clear to be either a Hebraization or perhaps a Hebrew dialect of the Egyptian Satanaf Pa'anch. It's just metathesis. It's just switching around two syllables. And what does that mean in ancient Egyptian? This is not just David Roll. Everyone knows that he is an important colleague, mentor, teacher of mine. But you have Dr. Kenneth Kitchen, who was one of the most respected minds in this field. Satanaf Pa'anch would have meant in ancient Egyptian, the one who is called the living one. And again, within the traditions that we find in Genesis, we have this idea of Joseph, wow, he is alive, Od Yosef Hai. So there, again, it's not to say that every, legendary, peripheral detail in the narrative, is a perfect history. So, my forebears were not historians. They were, Herodotus is aptly called the father of history. History being understood for its own sake. Hebrew writers, Semitic writers, just like Semites across the Middle East, Mesopotamia, we were symbolists. We were symbolic thinkers. So numbers, for example, are a whole language of their own. But that being said, there is just too much in those chapters for us to very strangely and inappropriately just turn around and go, no, it can't be Joseph because you actually already mentioned Moses, and these things can't be true no matter what. Even though this Anhu is portrayed in the stele of Reni Seneb, post-mortem, he's passed. Okay, that's what this shows. And anyway, again, I don't want to steal any fire from the course in which we're going to give so much more, but we see him seated next to his wife, Senet, who can, another Egyptologist, David Roll, as much as people commonly disagree with him in chronology, nobody can deny that he is a first-rate, world-class Egyptologist. And actually explained that when you read hieroglyphs, Senet can be Asenat. And Asenat is literally the name of the wife of Joseph. So we have this Anhu character who's, literally mentioned here, okay? And I'll be teaching the group how to read, okay, the hieroglyphs, so you can actually read it yourself. And the mistress of his household, the female master of his household, Asenat. So what are the chances of finding such an Anhu? And again, there's so much more in this section, whose wife happens to be Asenat, and who happens to have two major sons who were both viziers, whose names even seem to suggest something connected to Ephraim and Menashe. Ephraim and Menashe. With other sons, in fact, that would have associated themselves with one of those. So I think one of the issues is, unfortunately, is that when people do this work, it's just very common, to be weak in one of these. But if you are fluent in Tanakh and in oral traditions, and again, not to deify, not to say that anything needs to be perfect per se, okay? But if you understand the culture and you're a part of that culture, and you are also, an expert in these issues of the actual, field of Proto-Sinaitic, these inscriptions, that's really when these connections are possible, particularly when you give it a decade of your life and actually kind of masochistically, as if I'm looking for pain, seeking out criticism. So, yeah.
And for my final question, does the Moses inscriptions, the date of those Moses inscriptions, or when you think they date, do they line up with the chronology we see in the Book of Kings when it
Mhm.
places Moses 480 years before the construction before the first Temple of Solomon was finished? Um, is in the Torah. It doesn't tell us when Moses lived, but it doesn't name who the Pharaoh was. But in Kings, it kind of does and puts him 480 years before
Mhm.
the Temple of Solomon.
Yes. So what you are speaking of, what you're actually mentioning, is literally one of the biggest difficulties, for people trying to see if these line up for what's called the low date, the late date of an Exodus in the 19th dynasty, in the time of Ramesses. And that, in fact, is just almost the least of the weaknesses of that. The reason why people are, I just want to talk about that for a minute because everyone is most familiar with, oh, Ramses, the time of Ramses the Great. Um, it's completely understandable why people don't understand the issue. So, but one of the reasons why people feel forced towards that is because you see um, um, uh, wordings and things that definitely go back to that time. In other words, there is no Ramses, before Ramses, and yet you see that in Scripture. So for those people who are bothered by so many elements that seem to also scream out, you know, ancient Israelite culture in the New Kingdom period, okay? With they're very easily answered by one word, the fact of redaction. These texts that we hallow today, okay, Pentateuch, the Torah, these are redacted texts. That does not make them weaker from a theological perspective. That does not make them less. As an anthropologist, I actually have a university background in anthropology. You'll find something very fascinating that oral traditions or traditions that are maintained orally for a long period of time are commonly stronger than written down traditions. And just the way that Jewish texts and Hebrew Israelite texts grow in a sense, and you see this very much in the tradition of the Talmud, is that you have oral traditions surrounding what is a very small text. And just over the generations, more and more of that oral explanation gets included. So the problem, okay, with trying to fit these together, again, from a theological perspective, not from an archaeological perspective. From an archaeological perspective purely, again, it's a complete given that they have to work out. But for those really, breaking their heads and really trying to say, you know what, the Bible has so much history in it and elements that have been verified. Let's really try, not to be intellectually lazy. What you will find is that in the 19th dynasty, the low date, there's no fall of Egypt at that time. There's nothing that even remotely suggests any sort of a fall of Egypt, plagues in the time of the 19th dynasty. Egypt is just on a roll where you would look for that to test and to go see if there really is a time that fits those sorts of things. You would look for a fall, a crash of the kingdom. You would look for a time when you have foreigners just pouring into the land, and scripts such as the Ipuwer papyrus, which, as I understand, most scholars date to that Middle Kingdom period. Okay, latter Middle Kingdom, there are differences of opinion. Brooklyn slave papyrus, which actually is like a roster, of not like, it is a roster of Semite slaves with names that are straight out of the Bible. It might as well have been created by some Christian evangelical group to go plant as evidence or something. You have Yisachar, you have like Issachar, you have Shifra, Pu'ah, you have Avishai. These are biblical names and they're slaves. And anyway, and so much of that seems to be concentrated right before the fall of the Middle Kingdom period. And that is why, and there's just so much to that, behind that. So in the course, I'm literally going to go into the nitty-gritty. We're not going to talk about Bible. We're not going to talk about, for this course, I'm actually going to give our participants very important facts. And I say that word with very great care. In terms of the research such as David Lappin, a mathematician, using archaeoastronomy, comparing, for example, the finds of revised chronologists, okay, and with the Orthodox, the standard chronology. We'll actually get into a dozen different lines of evidence that, in fact, this 13th dynasty period, okay, should be moved forward by a couple hundred years. And when you do that, it happens to line up perfectly, not more or less, with what I understand to be the strongest biblical tradition when it comes to chronology. And by that, I'm referring to these chronology yielding verses. When I talk about how old people live to be, the period of Methuselah, of Methuselah, right? The period, the ages, and through Genesis and even a certain very important verse in Exodus. These are the tent pegs, okay, of any chronological model. So I understand the Exodus humbly, in that really I'm not a chronologist, and that's why I'm not going to publish this. I am an epigrapher. It's completely possible to understand these inscriptions to have existed at another period that some people may feel is a better match for the time of Moses. But I understand these to date to 3,450 years ago. Okay, that's what speaks to me. This is not something that there's not anything written on the inscriptions that screams that out per se, but I'll give you one point. There, at Serabit al-Khadim, right in the environment of those broken inscriptions, and you have a temple of Baalat, and it was very clearly burned to the ground, arson. And that dates to, apparently, the latter Middle Kingdom period. So, in other words, that is one point that really seems to suggest when you have, inscriptions that are literally calling out for violence against the cult of Baalat, and you see the Baalat temple destroyed, at a time that can roughly be dated, it does suggest that. However, let's say, for example, many people are into what's called the Middle Date period, the time of Amenhotep II. I differ with this position. However, I'll give you an example of how these inscriptions could be understood to be later. One of my most important mentors, I mentioned him a couple times, Dr. Ludwig Morenz of Bonn University. Strangely, and I don't say that with any disrespect, he thinks that the Wadi El Hol inscriptions, those are inscriptions found on this, this old highway, okay, connecting, I think connecting Thebes to Memphis per se. Anyway, they're associated with the stele of Pharaoh Amenemhat III. So more than 90% of scholars understand these. They really confidently date those to that early period, to the time that I would say is likely to be the time of Joseph. Okay, and I actually present them in my proto-paper, my proto-thesis. However, he understands that those are New Kingdom, that those were just written later. So I understand, just like my colleagues on this, and there's a lot that I disagree with them on, that yes, they really seem to go back to that time of Amenemhat III, not just because they seem so associated with this stele of Amenemhat III, but you see how the epigraphy seems to be so archaic, the way that they were writing the letters, it's like they were just starting out. But Dr. Ludwig Morenz is one of the greatest minds in the world. So he understands that this could be New Kingdom period. Why couldn't some of these, these inscriptions, for example, that we ascribe to the 13th dynasty, in principle, why couldn't they belong to a later time? But again, in the master course, we're really going to give our participants tools to be able to make up their own minds and really get into the methodology. And we're all going to learn a lot.
I forgot to add one more part to my last question. Who do you think the Pharaoh of the Exodus was?
So again, with respect to other opinions, I think there is strong evidence that points to Dudimos II, because that is the parallel of the Greek form of it, Tutimos. There's some people who want to say Thutmos, doesn't work out. Tutimos is Dudimos. And that name, for those who are into this field, that is the name of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, for example, in Josephus, which he's copying from earlier traditions. So it seems pretty clear to be Dudimos. One attack on that, and it just shows how, and again, I don't want to attack anybody person. I rest on the shoulders of people greater than me. People said there was no chariot force in those days. We only see the chariot being, in Egypt, that force, at a particular time. Who is his son? Who is his crown prince? Khonswe. And again, all of this you're going to enjoy. Everyone's going to enjoy this in the master course. In the lower left corner of his stele, of this son, this prince, you see he and his wife, their occupations. The occupation of the wife is represented by a mirror. She was, busy being beautiful for her husband. Okay, and you see his occupation, gloves, the gloves of a charioteer. And indeed, that is what a crown prince would do. That's the way that they were trained, was to go out to battle. And so there is so much, not just ignorance about what we find in the Egyptology, but also a creating of false dichotomies. Like for example, well, it says Ramses, so it had to have happened in the 19th dynasty. No, one of the strengths of this tradition. How is it that we could have a written tradition that has so many elements that, really suggest they come from ancient Egyptian culture? Such a well-preserved tradition as we find in the Pentateuch. Only if you had scribes who over time were updating the text, or actually putting place names that the later Israelites would be familiar with. And we have, again, this doesn't work for Christians, but this is actually part of my own tradition, as a the Jewish sages. Even from the days of the Talmud, there were those who recognized and understood that there were later redactors. And that did not decrease the value of the text for anyone. So anyway, I'm not here to present anything as Torah from Sinai as absolute truth. I've been on a journey for nearly a decade with these inscriptions, and this is an incredible milestone along that journey, which now I'm no longer pursuing as some independent researcher, okay, supervised privately by Dr. Vanderveen. I am now continuing this work under the auspices and as, under part of the Department of Archaeology at Ariel University. And so it's greatly exciting to me personally.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Michael.
You're most welcome. And thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.